So please join me in welcoming, first of all, Luke Smythe.
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks to Mark for the invitation to speak here this morning. It's early in the day, and I shall accordingly be speaking about Richter's early work. With the growing focus on the private dimension of Richter's early photo paintings in recent years, the notion that the iconography of these works was essentially random and thus impersonal has by now been put to rest. In this regard, the trajectory of commentary on these paintings has simply followed Richter's own increasing willingness to bring the private motives for his early subject matter choices to light, a tendency in sharp contrast to his preference during the early decades of his career to hide these decisions behind a carefully cultivated veneer of indifference. For this reason, we have come to know more about his interest in the iconography of specific photo paintings in recent years, a trend that my own work on the role of abstraction in these images extends. I'm currently writing a dissertation that surveys the role of abstraction in Richter's work throughout his career, his photo paintings included. Far from viewing these works as arch-mimetic by virtue of their origins in photography, I instead regard them as images in which mimesis and abstraction collide, the former practice being manifest in their photographic imagery and the latter in their enigmatic blurring, which serves in every instance to sweep their imagery toward a state of de-differentiated formlessness, such formlessness being, of course, entirely abstract. In order to understand how the blur and thus abstraction functions in the photo paintings, I found it helpful to think about these works in two contexts: that of Richter's prior experiments with abstract art during the late 1950s and early 1960s, which are seldom discussed, and that of his passage from East to West Germany in March 1961. When we do this, as I'll shortly make clear, we can see that the blur itself, no less than Richter's choice of subject matter in the photo paintings, also had a private motivation, namely an urge to escape the profound feelings of isolation, disorientation, and exile that plagued him during his first years in Dusseldorf. During his training as a socialist realist mural painter at the Hochschule für Bildende Künste in Dresden between 1952 and 1956, Richter knew little about abstraction beyond what he could glean from occasional book plates, hearsay, and magazines from the West. His awareness of non-objective art was thus extremely fragmentary, yet it fascinated him nonetheless, and from 1957 onward, he began to make his own tentative forays into abstract territory. And I'm showing you a work in which he found a Mondrian image to use as a backdrop to a figure he'd derived from Picasso in a mural design that draws on Paul Klee. Not until 1959, however, when he visited the Documenta 2 exhibition in Kassel, West Germany, did this stance begin to change. Stunned by what he later termed the sheer brazenness of the abstract works he encountered at Documenta, what had hitherto existed as an object of curiosity now came to feel like a powerful symbol of his personal and creative confinement under socialism. True to the hopes of some cultural actors in the West, the abstract work at Documenta had imprinted itself upon him as a sign of the unfettered individual freedom available under democracy, a freedom he hoped to win for himself when he fled the GDR in March 1961. The 18-month period following this flight, which corresponds to Richter's first 3 semesters at the Kunstakademie Dusseldorf, comprised the least well-researched period of his career. Yet this time span is crucial for what it tells us about his first responses to Western life, which had an enduring impact on his art. As the letters Richter wrote to friends in the East in 1961 and 1962 make clear, he felt extremely isolated and anxious following his arrival in the West, sentiments that also registered in his paintings of this period. Many of his first works from Dusseldorf show an anemic figure floating weightless and alone amid undefined surroundings. Like its surroundings, the figure too is indefinite and is yet to acquire a clear identity. Sometimes it is cut in two, as if situated in two locales at once, like Richter himself at this time, as he himself acknowledges. Succeeding these figure paintings were more abstract, materialist works, which no longer depicted the body in any obvious sense, but instead alluded to it indirectly, in the same decimated, abject, and near formless fashion as the work by informal painters like Vals, Jean Fautrier, and Jean Dubuffet, from which they derived. Yet Richter was not simply mimicking the styles of these artists. As he later told Dietmar Elgar, his informal-oriented works evinced his very real sense of existential exposure and uncertainty during this troubled period of his life. What we see in these abstract paintings, therefore, is a potent evocation of Richter's feelings of exile as a recent immigrant from a radically different social and political space. It is this exposed and isolated state of mind, I would argue, that he hoped to overcome in his earliest photo paintings, though with little success. In the photo paintings Richter created in the early and mid-1960s, his first order of business was to examine his relationship to a variety of forms of collective experience, both widespread and localized, contemporary and traditional, that were linked in different ways to the subject matter he chose to paint. In this way, he hoped, among other things, to use his photo paintings to clarify his sense of who he was and wanted to be in the West, to help establish where he might fit in and where, by contrast, he might wish to stand apart. While the details of this process are complex, the upshot was a notoriously nomadic body of work that showcased his continued inability to identify himself wholeheartedly with any of the forms of collectivity his works addressed. Throughout this period, therefore, Richter remained in search of a much-needed sense of stability, security, and empowerment amid the turbulence and unfamiliarity of his new surroundings, which he was, however, unable to access. Choosing from among the several hundred photo paintings that Richter produced between late 1962 and 1965, when his creative interests began to shift away from photo painting, a handful of works will have to represent the shifting vicissitudes of this process. The early painting Firing Squad from 1963 is typical of the first phase of Richter's engagement with photo painting, in which he examined his relationship to four major forms of Wirtschaftswunder-era collective experience in West Germany: mass consumption, Heimat or homeland culture, religion, and celebrity culture. Firing Squad speaks to the first of these phenomena, positing a link between the eagerness of West Germans to forget their memories of the war by embracing the distractions of American-style consumer culture. In this now lost painting, a found image of a Gestapo execution of prisoners was juxtaposed with an upside-down row of smiling heads, showing the same beaming blonde woman 5 times over. The source for this smiling visage was a toothpaste advertisement, with the murky gestural swirls of Firing Squad's upper register threatening to infiltrate its clean and brightly painted lower regions from above. A stark division was established between historical cruelty and contemporary beauty in this work, which leads credence to Benjamin Bucklow's thesis that Richter had a stake in the early 60s in condemning the West German eagerness to forget the events of the war by means of a headlong flight into the arms of mass consumption. Other paintings from 1963 assumed a similarly critical stance toward religion, as in Pope. The visions of Germany as a perennially pastoral and conflict-free nation that resided at the heart of Heimat culture, as in Schloss Neuschwanstein, and the diversions of celebrity culture, as in Mouth, which was copied from a photograph of Brigitte Bardot. In view of the crude, disturbing, or merely puzzling ways in which Richter distorted these images, rendering Bardot's mouth as a red-rimmed, uninviting cavity, Schloss Neuschwanstein as a pale, ghost-like edifice, and the Pope as an eerily vacant silhouette. They could be read as disfiguring indictments of his fellow citizens' eagerness to paper over their disastrous recollections of the war in one of several ways. With a reassuringly tranquil and bucolic image of their nation, a flight into the absolving embrace of the church, or a vicarious participation in the lifestyles of the rich and famous. Richter's inability to identify wholeheartedly with the major forms of contemporary West German collective experience he addressed in his photo paintings of 1963 prompted him to look elsewhere for the comforts of collectivity in his works of 1964 and 1965, as well as in occasional images thereafter. The result was a fragmented search that issued in a series of elegiac engagements with forms of shared experience, both large and small, that the passage of time and his own life history had rendered unavailable or problematic. At issue in his famous painting Uncle Rudy, for example, are two forms of shared experience he felt unable to access, that of a sheltering and secure family life and a similarly sheltering connection to a national past, both of which had been casualties of the war and its aftermath. As is by now well known, Richter's childhood was famously unsettled, not only by the war, but by the fractious relationship of his parents. Richter's mother was inclined to denigrate his stepfather, Horst, who never recovered his dignity after returning from the war. For this reason, throughout his childhood, she encouraged Richter to take his uncle, who had been killed in combat, as a lost father figure. His mother's attitudes towards his uncle and father, whom he later discovered was his stepfather, carried over into his treatment of the two men in his art. While his wish for the kind of harmonious family life he had never experienced is, as Dietmar Elgar has noted, writ large in his photo paintings of other people's families from the 60s. Beyond the war, and its savaging of both his family life and his national identity, lay a long tradition of what Richter refers to as classical European culture, with which he would also have liked to connect in his art. To do so would not only help to compensate for the war's disasters, but also for his own frequently disheartened response to the failure of post-war West Germany to recapture the cultural standards of the past, now that reconstruction was underway. This disheartened attitude is recorded in a painting like Administrative Building, which Richter has said he painted in response to the dreary and inhuman character of much post-war architecture in Dusseldorf. His efforts to reconnect with Europe's classical past, meanwhile, are present in his numerous excursions into traditional painting genres such as portraiture, the nude, and landscape painting. As Richter noted in 1972, and I quote, "The past is not over and done with, but continues to belong to us until we have forgotten it." His genre exercises of the 1960s could thus be viewed as works that sought to take the measure of this belonging, and thus of his ability to innovate pictorially within the stabilizing and collectivizing framework of tradition, rather than seeking at every turn to liquidate tradition in an avant-garde fashion. Enumerating the myriad states of exile to which the early photo paintings bear witness, the sense that one acquires of Richter's persona during the early and mid-1960s is of a troubled subject who, in attempting to acquire a more secure and consolidated sense of himself amid his complex and dynamic surroundings, was instead obliged to contend with feelings of increasing weightlessness and dislocation. And the chief reason for these feelings, it would seem, was an inability to identify wholeheartedly with empowering sources of collective experience. Moving restlessly from one theme and subject to the next in ever-increasing circles, across growing spans of time and space, during this period of his career, Richter became a social, cultural, and historical nomad, incapable of locating any ground solid enough to anchor his identity in the West. By virtue of this instability, it is difficult to know where exactly to position Richter in relationship to his early photo painting output, this standpoint being as fugitive and indefinite as the surfaces of the paintings themselves, a comparison that, by way of analogy, brings us to the matter of the blur and its abstracting operations within the photo paintings. When Richter first began producing photo paintings, he claimed on 2 occasions that he had no idea why he blurred them, as he wrote in 2 sets of notes from the mid-60s. Even when I paint a straightforward copy, something new creeps in, whether I want it to or not, something that even I don't really grasp. And in a second statement, if my paintings differ from the originals, this is not intentional on my part. It is not a matter of design, but of technique, and technique lies outside my voluntary control and influence. In addition to these claims, Richter offered several alternative accounts of the blur's motivation and meaning during the 60s, which pulled in conflicting directions. These ranged from a desire to somehow clarify the content of his works by blurring them, to making his works look less artistic and more mechanical, to giving his imagery the sense of being wholly in movement, and several other suggestions besides. Not until 1972, it should be noted, did he claim that the blur conveyed something about the uncertainties of his own relationship to reality, the reading that has since become dominant among critics and commentators. The collective effect of these scattershot comments, which have been followed up by many others over the years, is to bolster the credibility of Richter's initial claims that his reasons for blurring his first photo paintings were ultimately obscure to him. For my own part, I see his blurring of these works as relating on a semantic level to his continued sense of isolation in the early 1960s, and as deriving procedurally from his exposure to the work of his teacher during 1962 and 1963, the German informel painter Karl Otto Goetz. Richter was enrolled in Goetz's class at the Kunstakademie Düsseldorf during the period in which he transitioned from informel painting in the manner of his Materialist works to his early, more painterly photo paintings. As the residually gestural nature of these early photo paintings suggests, there were formal aspects of informel that continued to interest him after he began painting from photographs. As his interest in photo painting deepened, however, these forcefully disruptive gestural passages were replaced by the more subtly entropic and degrading activities of the blur. With its tendency to break down the imagery of the mature photo paintings in less dramatic ways, generally by means of a fuzzing or smearing effect. Here too, however, a debt to informel remained in place, both formally and above all procedurally, for Richter's approach to his blurring process owes a likely debt to Goetz. In the 1950s, Goetz developed a highly dynamic and calligraphic approach to gestural abstraction, whose energetic appearance was made possible by an unusual combination of poster glue and gouache that permitted him to work at abnormally high speeds. Goetz's elegant, vortical compositions were typically executed in a matter of minutes or sometimes even seconds. While Goetz often referred to his whiplash painting strokes, which tended to scramble any clear sense of figure and ground in his works as a kind of Handschrift or handwriting, he was at pains to correct the frequent misapprehension that his work was produced according to self-expressive directives. What he instead emphasized was his desire to work so rapidly as to preclude the possibility of conscious decision-making, thereby closing his work off from the influence of subjective expression. This emphasis on rapid execution was the vehicle by means of which he sought, and I quote, to leap beyond the limits of subjective representation. As he noted in a 1959 essay, and I quote again, "The faster the handwriting, the slighter the level of control and the more anonymous the image that establishes itself within the composition." In much of the critical discourse on both European informel and American abstract expressionism, the notion of painterly automatism was conceived as granting access to a deeper or more authentic realm of self-expression, liberated from the constraining interference of the conscious mind. For Goetz, however, matters were reversed, with automatism being framed as a device for utterly expunging subjectivity from his work. As his Materialist works make clear, Richter had initially approached Informel from a resolutely self-expressive standpoint, a stance that began to reverse itself following his arrival in Goetz's class. With their pathos-laden and angst-ridden titles, such as Wound, Scar, and Resection, and the evocation of Richter's feelings of loneliness and disorientation following his flight from the East, his abstract works of 1962 had clearly been produced along self-expressive lines. 2 years later, however, as his commitment to photo painting deepened, he would stress the connection of his new painting style, premised on the rote copying of existing images, to an impersonal and self-abnegating understanding of Informel in line with that of Goetz. As he wrote in 1964 or 1965, "When I paint from a photograph, conscious thinking is eliminated. I don't know what I'm doing. My work is far closer to the Informel than to any kind of realism." While Richter's rejection here of the notion that his photo paintings have anything to do with realism might seem strange in light of the arch representational character of photography, whose unrivaled capacity to convey an unbiased image of the world is celebrated at length elsewhere in his notes and interviews, what he is stressing here is the issue of his painting process. To Richter's way of thinking, in both photo painting and Informel alike, there is a shared emphasis on the suppression of conscious decision-making during the painting process, something that would not be possible in the case of ordinary realist painting, premised as such painting typically is, on a carefully considered process of making and matching. Elsewhere in the same series of studio notes, Richter alludes to the way in which his blurring techniques might also be aligned with the impersonal character of Informel painting. "All that interests me," he writes, "is the grey areas, the passages and tonal sequences, the pictorial spaces, overlaps and interlockings. If I had any way of abandoning the object as the bearer of this structure, I would immediately start painting abstracts." In Richter's photo paintings, it is the application of his blurring techniques that betrays his interest in these abstract pictorial qualities, for in each case, they bring a representational image one step closer to the threshold of abstraction, closer, that is, to a state in which the whole work would register as nothing more than an aggregate ensemble of grey areas, passages and tonal sequences, pictorial spaces, overlaps and interlockings. And I'm breaking with chronology here just because these two versions of Annunciation after Titian make the point I'm trying to make more clearly than the earlier photo paintings. Meanwhile, the blurring process, which he administered in an unpremeditated and improvised fashion, gave him the freedom to relinquish his self-consciousness at a certain point in his painting process and work, for the most part, without explicit thought. Though Richter does not recall discussing Goetz's impersonal conception of abstraction with his teacher, and was only briefly taken by the possibility of using Goetz's work as a stylistic model for his own practice, he does recall that the automatism of his teacher's working methods appealed to him as an alternative to the self-expressive histrionics of other forms of abstraction. It was not the speed of Goetz's technique that counted, but its impersonality, due to its ability to free him from the burden of conscious decision-making and deliberation as he worked. In light of this recollection, it seems likely that Goetz's impersonal approach to abstraction made its mark on Richter, helping to shape his similarly impersonal approach to the blurring of his photo paintings. Whether or not Goetz's technique did rub off on Richter, I consider the impersonal and self-dissolving nature in which he enacted his blurring process to be of central significance in his early photo-based works. While in later years he would seek to use the blur to generate specific pictorial or semantic effects within his works, during his first years in Dusseldorf, we may view Richter's impulse to efface the imagery of the photo paintings as stemming from an urge to free himself from the troubled process of consolidating a secure, collectively integrated Western identity in his art, by yielding to a pictorially enacted loss of selfhood. If Richter's selection of the subject matter of many of his early photo paintings was rooted in a desire to access forms of collective experience capable of helping him assimilate securely to his new social surroundings, his urge to obscure the surfaces of his works can be seen, in line with this aspiration, as a recurrent bid to distance himself from the feelings of loneliness and anxiety to which this problematic process continued to give rise, by means of a blurring procedure that enabled him to temporarily free himself from himself and hence from the anxieties of his creeping sense of social isolation. Unable to identify himself in terms of the prevailing categories of social experience governing life in West Germany in the early 60s, or with any of the other forms of collective experience he explored in his early photo paintings, Richter remained dogged by feelings of loneliness, disorientation, and anxiety. His response to this condition was to seek to suppress his pained sense of selfhood as he blurred his compositions. While susceptible to a range of readings once in place, during Richter's own painting process, the blur enacted a simultaneous gesture of leave-taking from his troubled relationship to his subject matter and from himself. Hence from the mounting insecurity and groundlessness of his life in the West. Abdicating briefly from his laborious process of self-definition in the West, Richter flirted as he blurred his imagery with a vertiginous loss of selfhood, just as the deadpan and mechanical facades of the early photo paintings masked a much more personal and unsettled process of subject matter selection. His impersonal approach to blurring emerged as a result of a highly personal set of creative considerations. For this reason, we can regard the abstracting operations of the blur as adding a further twist to the already complex dynamics of personality and impersonality at work in these paintings. Thank you.